You step off a boat into a Greenland fjord, and the first thing that surprises you is the color. It isn't white, it isn't a frozen wasteland, it is green, low grass clinging to the slopes, the water beneath you dark and glassy, the air sharp enough to feel like cold metal in your lungs. And then, half hidden in the hillside, you see it, a house shaped like a low mound of earth, with smoke curling up from somewhere inside it, as if the ground itself were breathing. 1,000 years ago, a Norse expedition led by Erik the Red sailed along this coastline after being exiled from Iceland for manslaughter, and in around 985 he founded a farm here at a place called Bradalid. He had a gift for marketing as well as survival. He reportedly named this icebound land Greenland specifically to make it sound inviting enough that other settlers would follow him. It worked. Within a few years, 25 ships loaded with colonists, livestock, and tools set out from Iceland to join him. Only 14 are recorded as having survived the crossing. The ones who made it built not a camp, but two permanent colonies, the eastern settlement near the southern tip of Greenland, and the smaller western settlement hundreds of kilometers up the coast, that would together grow to roughly 2,000 to 3,000 people spread across some 400 to 500 farms, and would last for nearly 5 centuries. The real puzzle isn't how they arrived. It is how a society with no forests, almost no metal of its own, and a growing season measured in weeks managed not just to survive here, but to thrive for hundreds of years, and then vanish almost without a trace. Start where every Greenland story starts. The water, walking along the shoreline, boots scraping over stones. The fjord feels quiet but not peaceful, the kind of quiet that seems to be watching you. That is because it isn't really a coastline at all, it is a highway. With no roads possible across this terrain, the fjords functioned as streets, connecting one farm to the next far more reliably than any path over rock and ice could. A boat slides past in the distance, riding low and heavy with cargo, and you find yourself wondering what could possibly be valuable enough to ship out of a land that can barely grow a tree. Hold that question, because the answer is about to make this colony far more interesting than a simple survival story. Follow the path inland and the farm itself comes into view. From a distance it looked like a lump in the earth. Up close, it has clearly deliberate engineering. The walls are built from thick layers of turf stacked like bricks, with a stone foundation at the base to stop dampness from rotting the scarce timber inside. The roof is so heavy with insulating turf that the whole building looks like it has been pressed back down into the hillside it has carved from. This wasn't a style choice, it was the only way to survive a winter with almost no firewood. Archaeologists who excavated one of the largest farms, at a place called Garder, found a cattle byre with stalls for 96 animals under a single roof. Proof of just how much wealth, and how much risk, these households were managing. Duck through the low doorway and the world shrinks immediately. Firelight flickers, smoke gathers near the ceiling, and you notice there is no wasted space anywhere. Every corner stores something, every beam serves a purpose, because winter will eventually test every weakness this house has. Step back outside, though, and you realize the house is only the center of a much larger machine. In the farmyard there are storage sheds, tool racks, coils of rope made from walrus hide because rope-grade plant fiber barely grew here at all. Then you hear it, animals. In Greenland, livestock wasn't a comfort, it was wealth, status, and food, all at once, and also a gamble. Because if the animals died over winter, the farm didn't just struggle, it often ended. That is why the home field mattered more than almost anything else on the farm. This was the green heart of Norse Greenland, not wheat, not barley, which barely grew here even in the warmest centuries, but grass and hay. Settlers cut it, dried it, and stacked it as if it were currency, because in a sense it was. Every bundle of hay was a future day of survival for the animals that kept the household alive. How much hay does one cow need to make it to spring? How many animals can a single farm actually afford to keep? This wasn't farming as folklore imagines it. It was logistics with a heartbeat, and isotope studies on Norse Greenland skeletons show that. As centuries passed and the climate slowly cooled, people leaned harder and harder on marine food. Seals, fish, seabird eggs, whale meat from the occasional stranded animal, because the home fields alone could no longer carry the weight of feeding everyone. Walk past the main house and you'll find something that explains why people endured all of this: a church. It is modest, nowhere near as imposing as the cathedrals of Europe, but that modesty is deceptive, because the presence of a church at all tells you these were not temporary settlers passing through. They were a community that expected to stay. Remarkably, Norse Greenland eventually had its own bishop as seat, established at Garder in 1124, complete with a cathedral built from imported sandstone and local stone. an extraordinary structure to find at what was, by any measure, the most remote edge of medieval Christendom. This is where news traveled, where marriages were recorded, where the dead were remembered, and where Greenlanders quietly insisted, generation after generation, that they were still part of a wider Christian world. Even though ships from that world might not arrive for a year or more at a time, that wider world is exactly where the fjord and the boats come back into the story. Return to the water in summer, and the settlement feels completely different, because summer here isn't pleasant weather, it has a narrow window, and everyone moves like they know it. Boats travel more often, supplies shift, people visit neighboring farms they haven't seen in months. And down at a small stone landing, worn smooth by generations of use, you'll find barrels and bundles waiting to be loaded for the voyage back to Norway. This is the part of the story most people never picture when they imagine Viking Greenland. It wasn't an isolated outpost surviving on charity. It was a working part of a European trade economy. Walrus ivory carved into combs and game pieces, the spiraled tusks of narwhals sold across Europe as the horns of unicorns, at times worth more than their weight in silver. Live polar bear cubs and gerfalcons destined as gifts for kings, and sealskins by the boatload all left these fjords bound for Bergen and beyond. In return came the one thing Greenland could never produce itself in any quantity: timber and iron. With almost no usable forest of their own, Greenlanders even sailed west, beyond their own coastline, to a place the Norse sagas call Markland, most likely the forests of Labrador, specifically to cottonwood. And some Greenlandic Norse voyages are now believed to have reached as far as the short-lived settlement at Elens, Meadows in Vinland, modern-day Newfoundland, making Norse Greenlanders quite possibly the first Europeans to set foot in North America. To feel the human scale of all this, imagine one full day, in the steel-gray morning light, wind moving in low sheets across the water. Smoke rises again from the turf roofs, and people step outside and start working almost immediately. Idleness here feels dangerous, because every hour of summer is borrowed from winter. By midday the home field has become something like a factory line, cutting, turning, stacking hay in motions that look repetitive until you realize each one is a small countdown against the cold. In the afternoon, a boat might arrive, or a neighbor, or simply a message passed farm to farm, because isolation here is normal and contact is precious, as evening light stretches on longer than it should before finally fading to pale gold. The farm slows, the animals settle, and someone checks the stored hay one more time, the way you'd check on a vault. In this moment, around the year 1000 AD, Norse Greenland doesn't feel like a myth at all. It feels like a real, working society that made a genuinely difficult choice and, for 30 generations, made it work. But this is also where the story takes a darker turn, because Norse Greenland did not last forever, and exactly why it disappeared remains one of the most debated mysteries in medieval history. Starting around the 1300s, the climate that had allowed this whole system to function began to shift. The long, relatively mild centuries known to climatologists as the medieval warm period gave way to a colder stretch now called the Little Ice Age. Hay yields fell, grazing seasons shortened. At the same time, the Thule culture, the ancestors of today as Inuit, was migrating south into the same fjords the Norse depended on, far better adapted to a colder, icebound Arctic, and the historical and archaeological record hints at a complicated relationship that included both trade and conflict between the two peoples. Europe was changing too. The Black Death tore through Norway in the mid-1300s, killing so much of the population that the ships which had once visited Greenland almost every year became rare, then sporadic, then almost non-existent. The last bishop ever assigned to Gardar arrived in 1368. No replacement is recorded after his death. The very last written record of the eastern settlement is a wedding, held at the beautifully preserved stone church at Velsey in 1408, a document that, almost unbearably, reads like an entirely ordinary piece of paperwork, with no hint that the community around it was approaching its final years. Norwegian records mention a ship finally returning from Greenland in 1410, and after that single sentence, written sources simply go silent. What happened next is pieced together almost entirely from the ground itself. Excavations at sites with names like the farm beneath the Send reveal the final years in unsettling detail. Smaller cattle, more reliance on seal meat, soil so eroded from centuries of grazing and turf cutting that the home fields could barely produce anything at all. And, in some of the very last layers, signs that people were eating their farm dogs, a desperation measure almost never seen in earlier Norse Greenlandic households. Norwegian sources even describe an English pirate raid on the Greenland settlements in 1418. looting goods and reportedly carrying off captives, at a moment when the colony could least afford the loss of people or supplies. By some point in the mid to late 1400s, historians still debate exactly when the eastern settlement, the larger and longer-lasting of the two Norse colonies, simply ceased to exist, its farms left to the wind and the returning grass. No single cause fully explains it. Most historians today point to a combination of all of it at once: a cooling climate squeezing an already razor-thin margin of survival, a collapsing trade relationship with an increasingly indifferent Europe, soil pushed past its limit by 5 centuries of farming, and a world that, piece by piece, simply stopped sending ships. So this is Norse Greenland, not an ice prison, and not a fairy tale either, but a real, planned farming society, built into the fjords and sustained on hay, walrus, ivory, faith, and sheer discipline, one that thrived for nearly half a millennium at the very edge of the known medieval world, before climate, isolation, and time finally closed the door behind it. If there is another vanished world, city, or civilization you'd like walked through this same way, just say the word.